Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians in the southern section of the Donetsk region, while the other sections have had no developments over the past 24 hours due to the decisive battles that are taking place, which are a bit more stale due to the heavy fighting taking place. While in the southern section of the Donetsk region, it is more decisive with these daily updates that do not fail. So starting out with the recent updates, the Russians have advanced both in the direction of Velyka Novosilka and in the flanks of Kurakhove as well as within Kurakhove itself. We see that the current objective of the Russians in this isolated section of the front line, the southern Donetsk region, the Russians are fighting over Velyka Novosilka and Kurakhove. Velyka Novosilka, we're seeing a direct assault on it from Novodonetsk and the southeastern direction. There's a flanking maneuver by the Russians in the western direction and a flanking maneuver by the Russians in the northeastern direction. In the Kurakhove direction, there's direct assault head-on within the settlement itself. There's a push in the southern flank and there's a push in the northern flank. The northern flank push has two axes. There's a wide axis and a direct axis. In the southern flank, there's similarly a wide axis and a direct axis. To explain the difference that is present for the Russians to have 4 axes of attack in the direction of Kurakhove, yet only 2 in Velyka Novosilka, we have to take a look at the available Ukrainian soldiers and the available Russian soldiers. In the Velyka Novosilka direction, we see that the Russians are fighting using a single division. That is approximately 15,000 soldiers, between 15 and 20,000. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have approximately 8,000 soldiers in defense. A single battalion is approximately 500 soldiers, a single brigade is approximately 2,000 soldiers, and that adds up to 8,000 near Velyka Novosilka. In the meantime, here near Kurakhove in the northern and southern flanks, as well as within the city itself, the Ukrainians have 30,000 soldiers concentrated in that direction. That means that it is almost 4 times as many soldiers as the Ukrainians have available in Velyka Novosilka. At the same time, the Russians have approximately 2 to 3 times as many soldiers in that direction as they have in the Velyka Novosilka direction, with 2 Russian divisions operating in that direction and 1 DPR division operating in that direction, adding up to 3 divisions. That is between 45 to 60,000 soldiers. So the Russians have between 1.5 to 2 times as many soldiers as the Ukrainians have both in the Kurakhove and Velyka Novosilka directions. This allows the Russians to gain local advantages that surpass a 3-to-1 advantage, while at the same time holding a 1-to-1 equal on par balance of power in the other directions. This means that the Russians are able to constantly be on the offensive and not lose any momentum. And that also explains why there is a wide front and a direct front to the southern flank as well as the northern flank, as the Russians are here fighting against that many more soldiers compared to Velyka Novosilka, where it is only necessary for direct attacks towards Velyka Novosilka and a singular flanking attack from each flank. This is to capture as many Ukrainian soldiers into the pocket as possible, while also not keeping the pockets too wide to reduce the effectiveness of such a operation. Zooming in a bit more, focusing first on Velyka Novosilka, it is very clear what the Russians are going for right now. They're moving along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here near Rozdol'ne, where they are fighting over the fortified positions as well as storming the settlement itself, getting control of which would cut off the main road between Pokrovsk and Velyka Novosilka. It will also allow the Russians to have fire control by moving further down south to gain fire control over Novyo Kumar, cutting off yet another supply route in and out of Velyka Novosilka, while the Russians, with the capture of Revnopil, can now move northwest towards Novosilka, which will cut off the final road in and out of Velyka Novosilka, putting the Ukrainians in an operational encirclement where the only entrance and exit out of Velyka Novosilka is through open fields. The Russians have here successfully managed to capture approximately 14 square kilometers, 10 in the northern direction near Rozdol'ne and 4 northwest of Novodonetsk. The Russians are moving along the river line and the forest lines to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Velyka Novosilka and to take advantage of the capture of Rozdol'ne and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of the river line there. At the same time, there's some positional fighting here in the Remez village itself, where the Russians attempted to gain control over Makiivka. However, with the Ukrainian counterattack, they managed to resecure the settlement. And finally, the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainians on the western flank near Novodarivka, where heavy fighting is taking place over the settlement, and Rivnopil, where the Russians managed to capture the settlement, and the Ukrainians are attempting to recapture it with some local counterattacks. So the Ukrainians are working hard to keep the left flank open to continue the supply, while the Russians are here flanking the Ukrainians on a wider flank here in the northeastern direction towards Rozdol'ne to cut off the supplies in that direction as well. The objective of the Russians with the capture of Velyka Novosilka is to create a supply hub for further offensive operations here to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, but more on that on my Zaporizhzhia analysis video. Moving on further north, we see here in the direction of Kurakhove, the Russians have not just secured Rozdol'ne, but are also advancing down south from the settlement, fighting over the fortified positions in this direction. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the fortified positions bit by bit, to then flank the Ukrainian positions near the river line to force a withdrawal from Ilinka and the remaining settlements east of Hanivka. The objective of the Russians is to simply create additional pockets within the pocket to hurry up the withdrawal of Ukrainian soldiers, because what the Russians are really looking for is a withdrawal of Ukrainian soldiers, because when they are on the move, that is when they are the most vulnerable, as they are out in the open for the Russian artillery and drones to hit. If there's a large grouping, there are FAB bombs and cluster munitions. Therefore, the Ukrainians would be extremely vulnerable in a withdrawal, and that is what the Russians are trying to force with these developments taking place south of Vasylyi and north of Hanivka. To gain control over this eastern part without Uspinivka and Trudovo will allow the Russians to focus their forces on those two settlements, gaining control of which will create a direct road between the Russian positions in the south and up north towards Rozdol'ne, allowing for a stronger push towards Kurakhove. The Russians have also advanced within Kurakhove itself, crossing over the forest/river line here between the eastern and central section of the residential area of Kurakhove. With this, the next stage of the fighting has begun, the fighting over the central residential area. This will allow the Russians to slowly move through the positions of the Ukrainians, push them towards the southern outskirts and the apartment complex area within Kurakhove, allowing the Russians to then focus heavily with FAB bombs, potentially a TOS strike on these buildings, to attempt to wipe out the Ukrainian resistance remaining within the city. Together with the flanking maneuvers to the north and south of Kurakhove, the Russians will look to gain control over the city by the end of the year. Similarly, with the fighting over Velyka Novosilka speeding up, the Russians are likely looking to gain control over the settlement by the end of the year, after which the Battle of Pokrovsk in the north will begin, as the Russians will then look to finish off the remaining parts of the southern section of the Donetsk region, regain full control over the southern parts, and then allow for an offensive operation towards Pokrovsk from the south, southeast, and eastern directions. This will allow for a three-pronged attack towards Pokrovsk on a wide and wider and direct assault towards the city itself and the flanks. In the direct flanking assault north of Kurakhove, the Russians have advanced significantly within Berezhsky, pushing the Ukrainians out to the Dacha area in the northwestern outskirts of the settlements and the fortified positions they have available in the area, reaching the easternmost fortified positions, flanking it from the rear, getting control of which will allow the Russians to move through the railways in the northern direction, after which the Russians will do a combined strike towards the final fortified positions through the railways and from the Dacha area, gaining control of which will allow the Russians to then develop towards a steady tourney, with the control over the southern parts of Sontsivka. Will be a combined strike from the north and from the east to gain control over the fortified positions and the settlement there, following which the Russians can then push down south towards Dashne and Kurakhove, cutting off the supply lines and fighting over the industrial zone within the city, and with that, the end of the battle over the southern parts of the Donetsk region. As mentioned, the Ukrainians have approximately 40,000 soldiers in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, from Velyka Novosilka and Novosilka in the west to Kurakhove and Suntsivka in the north, of which many are in danger of encirclement in the pockets that are being created both in Kurakhove, south of Kurakhove, and in Velyka Novosilka, of which the Ukrainians are at risk at losing about half of these soldiers, while losing the settlements as well, which will give the Russians an advantageous positions both in terms of supply lines and in terms of territorial and geographical advantages that will be gained through the capture of these settlements, and will allow the Russians to start the battle over Pokrovsk as well. So it has a strategic significance in terms of the battle over the Donetsk region. At the same time, some escalation has happened in the background, so let me cover it quickly. The United States and European countries have allowed the Ukrainians to do long-range strikes within Russian territory, including different regions other than Kursk, which has resulted in multiple strikes, including a ATACMS strike in the Bryansk region and Storm Shadow strikes within Russia, of which approximately 14 of such have happened so far within just a few first days. This led to the Russians responding directly towards Ukraine with the launch of RS-26 missiles. However, it was only a warning. As we see with this footage here, it is simply a strike with dots. An RS-26 missile can fly over 6,000 kilometers. That means it can hit anywhere within Ukraine. And at the same time, it can carry 4 warheads, each with up to 250 kilograms of explosives. That means it can carry a 1 megaton nuke or conventional missile. These missiles were dots, and it is approximately 6 of these missiles that were launched because there are approximately 24 hits in the Dnipropetrovsk region within the city itself without any significant explosions. This means that these were unfilled with explosions. It's just simply the fuel that exploded. And therefore, we can see that it was simply a warning that the Russians are able to strike anywhere within Ukraine with high precision, high explosive weapons that could also include nuclear capacity, and therefore it advocates Ukraine to stop these long-range strikes. It is reported that the travel time of these missiles from them being launched to them hitting the target was less than 5 minutes. And that is exactly how significant these missiles are, because there's no time to react to them, there's no time to go into a bunker, there's no time to detect them on a radar and then go into hiding. If the Russians plan on striking you with these missiles, you will likely get struck by them, unless your air defense is extremely well made, and even at that point they may still bypass it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.